I'm Dr Anjana Khatwa and I'm the engagement lead at Wessex Museums, and I'd like to thank the organisers of this conference for inviting me along to talk about evolution and revolution, how to engage future generations with the Jurassic Coast. Today I'm going to talk about the future of engagement on this incredible site, but just so you know where I'm coming from, I'm kind of an expert in engagement, and I've been working in public communication of science, learning and engagement for over 20 years in the natural heritage sector. By background, I'm an earth scientist, so I kind of know about the science and how to make it accessible to people, particularly who are new to science. When I worked for the Jurassic Coast, I developed an award-winning education program, which is now a national program which is led by the Primary Science Teaching Trust. And this year I was incredibly privileged and very thankful to be awarded the R.H. Worth Medal from the Geological Society of London in recognition of my services to geoscience and earth science education. I think it's also important to know that I bridge lots of different areas. So although I have my kind of experience as an earth scientist helps me to understand the science of the Jurassic Coast, I also have experience of working within learning and engagement, but also as a woman of colour, I have many lived experiences of what it's like to be in a diverse group and living and working in an environment that is almost predominantly white, and how those lived experiences can define the way folks from diverse communities engage with natural spaces. Because of a lot of the work I do in this area, I was incredibly lucky, very fortunate and humbled to be nominated for a National Diversity Award in 2020 out of 64,000 people. So I'm a finalist for being a positive role model in race, faith and religion. So hopefully what that does is it helps to set the scene of what I'm going to talk about today, that I wear multiple hats. I consider engagement through a very intersectional lens, and because of that I have been recognised as quite a leader in the field, and I sit on many advisory panels helping organisations consider the needs of diverse audiences, particularly in the context of natural landscapes. And I advise the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Natural England and the National Trust on this at a national platform level. So just to kind of give you that recap, what is the environment that we're talking about? We're talking about a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And these are the beautiful cliffs at East Cliff, just outside West Bay. The Jurassic Coast is an extraordinary place. It's 95 miles long, and it records a near complete sequence of the Mesozoic, which is 185 million years of Earth's history. And that's absolutely phenomenal. And part of being a World Heritage Site is to ensure that extraordinary places like this are preserved now and for the future. You know, a big part of the World Heritage Programme is ensuring that folks from all over the world feel a connection to places like this with their global heritage story. But the other part of World Heritage is to ensure that communities, and particularly children and young people and those who are from diverse backgrounds, are engaged with the narratives and the stories and the meaning of the World Heritage Site. And these are the questions that I want to ask today, is how effectively does the Jurassic Coast as a site, the stakeholders who are involved in kind of working to engage people with its meaning and its narrative and its beauty, how effective is that work in engaging the people that we need to reach the most in the stories and the opportunities it can offer them? In 2001, the Dorset and East Devon coast, as it went onto the UNESCO list, was inscribed as a World Heritage Site. And this was the work of many people, namely Professor Dennis Brunsden and Tim Badman and Dave Andrews and Malcolm Turnbull. It was a team of people that literally got together and created a management plan, and the nomination document took about 11 years to do that. And then eventually it became a World Heritage Site and joined this really elite global list of places to share this accolade. But when we look at the site itself and who visits it and who is able to enjoy it. Sorry, I'm just going to have a drink. There are lots of issues that come to mind. We are in an era of COVID, and over the last year, 2020, this was an unprecedented time, and people have used that word a lot, haven't they? Unprecedented, but it really was. If you were a family living in the middle of an urban space like London or Manchester or Birmingham, and you weren't particularly lucky enough to have a house with a garden, you were stuck in a flat perhaps with 2 bedrooms, you probably had very little access to nature. And when the lockdown lifted after a very long time, those people who were living in spaces where nature wasn't readily accessible, where going out meant perhaps going to a local park and that was your experience with going outdoors, those people really needed to go somewhere beautiful and be inspired again by what the country offered. Imagine being in that kind of 4-bedroom flat in somewhere like Hackney or somewhere like, you know, Salford. It can be quite damaging for one's mental health, I think. So when those lockdown restrictions lifted, where did these people go? They went to some of the most beautiful places they had heard about. They went to places, you know, like the Lake District and the Peak District and Dartmoor National Park, but they also came to Dorset and Devon. They came to the Jurassic Coast. And you can see in this picture here, this is a picture that I've taken from a newspaper. And most recently, there were some headlines that came out from the landowner of this particular part of the Jurassic Coast. This is Durdle. And the landowner described these people who were flocking to these natural spaces as the culturally diverse. And I've taken that word slightly out of context because the culturally diverse were used in that statement as a focal point of blame. And what the statement said, it was actually a petition to the government to ask the government to do more to kind of prevent the inundation of people coming to natural spaces like this and leaving their litter. And that's a very laudable message. I certainly don't want to criticise that ethos that you know, people should be allowed to litter and leave rubbish all over the place. I absolutely agree that litter is everybody's problem and everybody has a responsibility. If they go and visit beautiful places like this, they should take their litter home with them. The difference with this statement was the words culturally diverse, and this provoked an absolutely national outcry, outrage, I would say, as to what these words meant. Who was it referring to, and why were they being singled out in particular? And as a person of colour, I watched the furor around this statement happen on social media. And as a woman of colour, I looked at that and I thought, does that apply to me? Is that statement singling me out as a South Asian woman, that if I go to places of natural beauty and people see me, they will automatically assume that I am responsible for the litter that they see on the beach? So you can imagine my indignation and my anger at seeing that statement come out, that petition. And I took action. I got together a group of organisations, and the Ramblers in particular, where I'm an ambassador, and I mobilised groups and organisations and voices together to write a letter to the Times to basically say, this is not acceptable. It is not acceptable to put the place of blame on a group of people where there is no evidence that they are responsible for the littering. And the letter didn't get published in the Times, but what it did for me was it showed me that there was a real movement and a dissatisfaction about natural heritage organisations not understanding the key issues to do with public engagement and natural spaces, to place the blame at the foot of the communities who are defined as culturally diverse really stems from a position of a lack of understanding and awareness of what those communities have experienced. If we are talking about Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, if we are talking about those living in very difficult, deprived circumstances, if we are talking about those living in urban spaces, there was such a lack of sensitivity and awareness as to where those people were coming from that it really did kind of affect me quite deeply on an emotional level, but also on a strategic level as well. And I wondered about this, and I've been thinking and talking about this for the last year and a half or so, particularly during lockdown. And in The Guardian last year, I was part of, I was quoted in an article with the Ramblers, and what we were talking about was the fact that what the pandemic has exposed is the disparity of access to natural spaces for those communities living in deprivation. And for the most part, if we look at it in an intersectional approach, those people are from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. They live in urban spaces, they live in deprivation. And I've also done my own analyses on different demographics across the country, and that is something you see very commonly. And my response to the culturally diverse statement was, why choose to publicly shame a group of people where instead we should be applying empathy and understanding and a kind of tone which is sympathetic to their needs? And I think what's really important here is to begin to look at our responsibility as a sector. And although I work for Wessex Museums, I'm speaking on behalf of my employer, this is what we are doing within our museum's environment. We are listening and we are empathizing and we are considering what it must be like for a person living in those circumstances, particularly during the very difficult last 12 months of being in lockdown and having civil liberties very limited. We're trying to understand what life is like for that person, for that family, and why, they may be moved to actions to visit natural spaces like Durdle, for example. And I think we as a sector, we need to carefully examine the messages that we give out in order to kind of reflect on ourselves as to what our sector can do better. Okay, that's where I'm coming from. Now, at Wessex Museums, I've kind of touched on that point of we as a partnership of 4 museums, and our museums are Wiltshire, Salisbury, Dorset Museum and Poole Museum. We are examining very, very carefully why we do not see more underserved audiences within our museum spaces. And I think that this actually equally applies to visitor centres and to museums about natural history. And I think it also applies to any organisations within natural spaces, natural heritage. We need to be asking those questions. Where are our underserved audiences? Because what COVID has shown us is that they are the ones at the very sharp end of not benefiting from the opportunities that nature and heritage can give them. And I think particularly when you look at where your organisations are getting funding from, so for example, let's take National Lottery Heritage Fund, let's look at the social demographic of who the lottery players are. Are they represented in the people, in the families that are accessing the heritage offer that you have on the table? And I think that's an interesting question to take back to where you work or who you work with. At Wessex Museums, we've performed, or I have led on performing a consultation exercise to ask the questions why there is not a greater representation of underserved audiences within our spaces. And when I talk about underserved audiences, I'm referring to young people, and I'm referring to families with children under the age of 5, and I'm referring to people living in deprivation, Black and Asian minority ethnic communities. And I'm also talking about, audiences with disabilities, whether they're visible or whether they're hidden. I did a 3-month consultation for Wessex Museums late last year when I joined. And I went out and I talked to museum staff, I talked to trustees, I talked to community groups. And what I found was there was a huge disparity between the way our underserved communities viewed the heritage sector and what it could offer them versus the internal structures and systems and staff and how that operated within the museum space. And I'm just going to sum this diagram up for you. Essentially, when I spoke to our kind of colleagues within the museums, I found that there was a huge lack of confidence and ability to reach out to those underserved audiences. In fact, I would almost put it into the kind of sphere of a slight fear and a slight apprehension at not knowing how to connect and how to work with and listen to those audiences. And that is why there was quite a kind of a disconnection between the two parties. There was a real kind of sense of staying within a comfort zone of working with audiences that they knew would pay off with, you know, a good level of engagement. And there was a lack of focus within the evaluation and within the strategic planning structure to really put first and foremost the needs of underserved audiences above those of the usual clientele. And I would say the usual clientele is upper middle class, you know, white and potentially retired communities. And so where you have that lack of understanding and the lack of confidence to engage with underserved audiences, where you have a slight apprehension and a fear of engaging with those groups, that inability or almost, you know, a fear of stepping outside of the comfort zone. I wouldn't say that there was a disinterest, but there was a certain apprehension there. And what that did, the impact on the communities was very, very stark. When I went out and I consulted with those communities, look at the comments that came back in those light blue circles. Many of the community groups and communities leaders said to me, we don't feel welcome in the museums. When we go there, we experience microaggressions that basically make us feel like we don't belong in that space. And microaggressions was through looks, it was through actions, it was through behaviors, it was through comments. And it was also, you know, those particular leaders talked about unconscious bias. They said that there were some reports that I got that some people would walk into a museum and they'd be followed around by a volunteer, you know, who was suspicious as to why they were there. And I think what this then feeds into is the lack of representation of staff and volunteers from those underserved community groups. So if you are, for example, somebody with a disability and you're going into a museum space and you don't see yourself represented in the volunteers or the staff, how do you then feel? Because if you're at the sharp point of receiving microaggressions, then you're wondering, you know, whether that museum really understands your needs if you don't see yourself represented. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting was that many of the community said to me that they were unaware of the audience offer or the programs, and that when they were flagged up, the stories didn't resonate or reflect their interests. And so again, this kind of highlights us to that yawning gap between what the organization is sitting in its safe space and doing in year after year, you know, not questioning whether they should be pushing boundaries. And then we've got the yawning gap between the communities on the periphery who just don't feel welcome. So that consultation really showed me some of the key aspects of the problem that we are looking at in terms of engagement as a whole. And I think the consultation that I did is actually quite relevant to cultural settings as well as natural settings as well. So coming back to the focus of this conference, Mary Anning, what I want you to really think about now is Mary Anning as a person. And I know we talk about her all the time, and she is a massive, huge bastion of science. And she is a huge historical figure within the science of paleontology. But she is not unique. She is not isolated in terms of her lived experiences and where they sit in a framework of today's engagement. And the question I want to ask you, if you are in an organization like a museum or a trust or an organization championing engagement with natural heritage, I want you to think about this question. How would you engage the Mary Anning of today? And what we need to do before we even begin to go down that road is to begin to change our mindset. We need to take an intersectional approach when we think about, when we begin to develop programs about engaging people like Mary Anning. And when I talk about intersectional approaches, I'm talking about engagement through a lens which considers all aspects of diversity. And this could be age, it could be gender, it could be your ethnicity, it could be class or race, or language even. So this is the lens that I want you to look at Mary Anning through, an intersectional approach, because once you begin to frame your mind looking at projects and engagement through intersectionality, essentially what you're beginning to do is you're beginning to open yourselves up to listening and understanding the needs of that audience first before your own needs as an organization. And I think it's really important that we look at quite a critical example of looking at intersectionality in practice. Here's an example. On the right-hand side, we've got a group of women and they're all white, and it's a ladder. And I have seen this within my lived experience of life and work and my career spanning over 20 years in the natural heritage sector in the US and in the UK. I have seen the argument used that if we have women in senior leadership roles, we have achieved equality. And therefore, you know, what more is there to do, you know? And actually what that's saying to people from diverse backgrounds. So imagine if you are a Black woman in a wheelchair, or imagine if you are an LGBTQ Asian man, or imagine if you're a woman of color like me. If you are being told by a group of white women in the senior leadership role that equality has been achieved in this theoretical organization, we don't need to champion a gay Black man, and we don't need to champion women of color, because that would make the rest of our cohort, who may all be white and able-bodied and heterosexual, that would put them at a disadvantage. Okay, so think about the fact that by platforming one section of diversity, which is white women, does not serve the needs of others who have all sorts of other aspects of needs on that intersectional spectrum. Okay, and I think that's a really important journey for you to go on, to understand that we must look in a very multi-dimensional way at championing equality, diversity, and inclusion within our practice. Okay, so that's just one example. The other thing that I think is really important to understand is that a beautiful fossil is not enough. And I cannot tell you the number of times I have seen projects and grant applications and kind of conversations being had that a beautiful fossil will solve all of the world's problems if we can take it to a group of children from a what's the word that I've seen used, hard to reach background. Okay, and actually there are so many things wrong there, because the word hard to reach or hard to provide for is unacceptable, because that places the onus on the audience member who we are trying to reach. It places the onus that they are at fault for not being in the right place to be engaged. When we turn that around and we call the audience that we wish to reach underserved, the onus is on us as organizations to change our practice and our thinking in order to change our practice to engage them. So once we begin to do this, we begin to understand the needs of the audience that we wish to engage. We must enter the world of Mary Anning as she is in order to understand her needs, and then we can look at our content and develop that around what she would like. So just to extend that slightly, let's break Mary Anning down in 2021. So today, if we looked at Mary Anning now, today, aged 9, she would be on free school meals. She would be living in digital poverty. she would be living in rural deprivation. She'd be suffering from malnutrition. And if you know children, particularly with the recent campaign run by Marcus Rashford and Fair Share, we know that children who suffer from malnutrition really perform poorly at school because they simply do not have the energy to maintain that level of concentration and work within those kind of very intense learning environments. Mary would have patchy school attendance because she may be required to help at home with her family, or she may be required to sell, you know, things in her father's shop in order to just get enough money in to put food on the table. Because of all of these things, she would have had limited life aspirations. So when you begin to understand and you begin to move into the space that Mary Anning exists in, do you think a beautiful fossil that you would show her at school would be enough to inspire her into a life of science? I very much doubt it. Because by understanding all of these aspects about her life, you can begin to understand, actually, what we need to do is talk to her and understand what is driving her and what would be a key aspect that we could bring to her life that would enable her, empower her, and give her agency in her own life to make those decisions about having a career in science in the future. And I think the key thing that we have to realise is, although we talk about Mary Anning as this figment of the past 200 years ago, you know, she was fighting a system, you know, she was experiencing misogyny from the male scientists at the time. This, Mary Anning, age 9, as she was 200 years ago, that reality is still very much the case for children today. And I think if you've read any of the reports that have come out during COVID, you will know that so many children now, you know, will suffer now and years to come because of the effects of not being in school, because of the effects of being on free school meals, because of the effect of being at home, perhaps in families that aren't conducive to a safe and healthy and happy environment. And those are the families that we need to reach. So what I want to move into is a revolution of change, a revolution of systemic change in the way we think about how the Mary Annings of today should be reached, should be worked with, should be inspired, engaged, and enabled. And in order to achieve this revolution, it requires a huge shift in thinking, in practice, and in governance of your structures. And this is what we're trying to do at Wessex Museums at the moment. I'm on a special programme with Wessex Museums. I'm in my role for 2 years, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And my role is to work with all 4 museums to create systemic change within the culture of the museums in order to welcome in underserved audiences into those spaces. So that's one part of my job. The other part of my job is working very, very closely with underserved communities to understand their needs and then work with them to bring them into the museum spaces. So I'm kind of operating on both sides of the fence, if you like, in order to reach that middle ground, and the middle ground is success. And what success looks like is the engagement of underserved audiences in our museum spaces with a long-term view towards a legacy, you know, of children, generation after generation, feeling that museums are relevant and welcoming to them and who they are. How do you begin to even achieve that? Firstly, we need to look at meaningful and impactful training and inclusive thought leadership that's built in throughout organisational structures. And I'm doing this at Wessex Museums, beginning with the trustee and the director level, because in order to filter down that inclusive thought leadership, it's got to start at the very top of organisations. And I'm doing this with our 4 museums. When we talk about championing inclusive thought leadership, this means that we are considering the needs of our audiences first and foremost, from the very top all the way down to the volunteers. So when those audiences come in through the doors, they're looking at the beautiful fossils in your museum, or they're going out on a fossil walk, their experiences are reflective of you as an organisation creating a warm welcome. And the way you do that is by listening to the lived experiences of minoritized groups. You have to go to their spaces. You have to show an interest in wanting to listen to their stories and their experiences, and then bringing that back and creating key actions and strategies that create action within your organization. So a really good example of this is I am the vice chair currently at the Dorset Race Equality Council, and I managed to broker a relationship between the Dorset Wildlife Trust and Dorset Race Equality Council. What that led to was the Dorset Wildlife Trust team on Brownsea Island attending, Dorset Wildlife Trust created a Zoom event with the Dorset Race Equality Council to invite Black, Asian, minority ethnic community leaders to come along and learn about what they do. Now, one particular youth group came along, and they were called the Youth Empowerment Platform, based in Bournemouth and Poole. And they represent young people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds who are interested in opportunities to develop skills and personal development. What that has now led to is the Youth Empowerment Platform working in partnership with the team on Brownsea Island to create opportunities for those young people to go out into nature and help on conservation programs. And this hasn't happened overnight. It has happened over, I would say, almost 4 months of consultation with those community leaders. And what the rangers at Brownsea Island have done is they have talked and they've listened and they've moved into their space. This is the community leaders. They've moved into that space to listen to what those young people want from that experience, okay? And those young Black people want to get out into nature. They want to find out more about the impact of climate change on the natural environment. They want to learn skills for the future. And what the team at Brownsea are doing is they're designing a program together with those young Black people so that those objectives can be achieved. And what we call that is co-creation. So instead of saying, here is a beautiful fossil, I'm going to take it to a school and do a talk and show it to them and then walk away again, that's very well and good, and that has a very short-term impact. But in order to build and kind of begin to scaffold an experience and a ladder up into a career, which may be in science, it may be in paleontology, it may be in becoming an accountant, who knows? But in order to build that ladder, you've got to scaffold in processes and systems and frameworks in order to ensure that that experience is built upon time after time, and that child is taken on a journey. And I think that's a really critical aspect of beginning to realize that this isn't about numbers, and it's not about getting as many people through the door. This is about the quality of the experience and understanding that where you are working with underserved audiences, they require more time and more commitment from you as an organization, because there is a real lack of trust there. And that lack of trust comes from decades. And we're talking, 10, 20, 30 years of being marginalized from the natural environment. When you begin to create systemic change within the organization, when you are addressing institutional racism, when you are addressing, issues associated with decolonization of your stories, when you are championing and training allyship, so your staff and your volunteers and your leaders understand what it truly means to be an ally, then you will begin to bring those underserved audiences into your space, and understanding the heritage value of the messages and the stories you want to bring across. And what you begin to see when you bring those changes into organizations is you will begin to see stories that reflect the interests of those underserved communities. You'll begin to, within yourselves, develop an audience offer that relates to them. Your welcome will be warm and considered, as, for example, a family, perhaps with a disabled child, comes in and visits your venue. And crucially, you need to really consider diversity within your governance structure and within your staff and your volunteers, because they say it all the time, don't they? There's a thing that they say about women in science: you can't be it if you can't see it. Well, that is certainly the case when you look at natural heritage organizations that are almost predominantly white. If you are looking and able-bodied, and when you are looking at engaging those culturally diverse members of our communities, you need to ensure that their voices and their faces are represented within your structures. I think also you need to consider very carefully who is in your network. So I've had a chance to look at the partnership plan for the Jurassic Coast, and one of the key things that struck me was the absence of community voices representing the underserved audiences that the plan has highlighted should be engaged with the natural environment. And there is that saying, you know, not about us without us, and that was used by an activist many years ago for disabled rights. But I think it equally applies to people of colour. It equally applies to people from the LGBTQ plus community. It equally applies to those who are neurodiverse. Are you consulting those organisations representing the voices of those communities within your strategic planning frameworks? If they're not there, ask yourself why they're not there. And when you look around the room, is it wholly white? Is it wholly able-bodied? Is it wholly male? How is that representative? How are the voices in the room representative of the people you wish to engage when they aren't there and you are not consulting with them or talking to them? So that is some key thinking points to consider in order to create a revolution which will enhance public engagement on the Jurassic Coast. And I talked a little bit about that project with the Youth Empowerment Platform. And here's a really good example that you can take away that shows you what Wessex museums are currently doing. We take an intersectional approach to how we recruit our audiences, and we are always led by our audience. So we don't take a fossil and show it to them and say, isn't this brilliant? And, you know, we want you to do a project all about this rock or this fossil. What we do is we inspire them, perhaps by just generating a spark of interest. And then we are asking them, go away and do some research, find out more about climate change, and then come back to us and tell us what you would like to do, because we have funding for you to do X, Y, and Z if that is what you wish, okay? And one particular project we have going on is to do with the climate emergency and engaging young people in creating responses to the climate emergency, and then for that response to go into the museum's permanent collections. And we are using this pathway to create those responses. We are expecting young people, so for example, that group with the Dorset Wildlife Trust, we're expecting them to work with the wardens on Brownsea Island, to be trained in, I don't know, looking at freshwater ecology and the impacts of sea level rise on those ecological communities. They'll be guided by one of our community curators who will be able to offer funding to that group, and that group will decide how they wish to use it. They may want to hire a digital freelancer to help them make TikTok videos. They may want to hire an artist that helps them to write poetry. I don't know. I'm not the best person to say what they should do with that funding. They are. And once we've created that response, that will then go into an exhibition in our museums, and then those responses will go into the permanent collections. So you can see how we've structured an engagement program which is entirely led by the audience that we wish to engage with. And crucially, that is an underserved audience. These are a group of young Black people living in Bournemouth. There's about 15 or 17 of them. And, you know, if we had switched it round the other way, it just wouldn't work, because we can't say for sure that a young Black person living in the middle of a housing estate in Bournemouth really cares or understands anything about the ecology of Brownsea Island, because they've never been there. Because why would it matter to them? And so you have to twist your approach round to really work from their position, a bit like that Mary Anning example I gave you. So what action can you take now? There is an absolutely phenomenal opportunity for you to begin to hear from the voices of diverse communities. This symposium is called Changing Landscapes, Actioning Change. And it's an organizational and BAME leadership program. So effectively, what this symposium is doing is it trains Black, Asian and minority ethnic people to become leaders within the natural heritage sector. And as organizations, you can move into that network and learn from those voices. And so when I talked about listening to the lived experiences of people like myself, this is a perfect opportunity to do that. So I do encourage you to have a look at that. And that's run by a CIC in Scotland called Backbone, and they're on Twitter, they're on social media, and they have a website. You can find out more about them. The other thing you can do is listen to lived experiences from diverse community groups. There's Black Girls Hike, there's the Gay Outdoor Club, they're on Twitter. I'm deliberately not providing you with the Twitter or the Instagram handles, because I want you to take the initiative to go and find out who these organizations or who these people are. So the onus is on you to take that step forward. Debbie North is a fantastic person to follow. She is an OS Get Outdoors champion, but she actively champions disabled access to natural spaces. Alex Staniforth really has done phenomenal work, really championing the benefits of the natural environment in terms of mental health. Dara McNulty, wonderful, wonderful young man who I've got to know so well over Twitter. He wrote the Wainwright winning novel about the diary of a young naturalist. He's a phenomenal person to follow, because he really reveals what life is like for a young person with autism who wishes to engage with nature. And he's just such a wonderful person to follow on social media. And Amar Lateef, he's a blind adventurer and explorer. I mean, just his work has been phenomenal and outstanding. So when you begin to put yourself in a position where you can listen to these lived experiences, you'll see yourself changing. And that leads me to the end of my talk. Hopefully what you've seen is almost like I would say a controversial approach to ask yourself, could you do more as an organization, as an engagement lead, as somebody who's passionate about welcoming all audiences to the Jurassic Coast? But what I've really focused on are the Mary Annings in the 21st century. Is that 9-year-old living in deprivation? It could be, you know, a 9-year-old white girl living in rural poverty in the middle of Dorset. It could be a 9-year-old Black boy who's living, you know, in really deprived circumstances, perhaps, you know, no access to digital resources. These are the communities that I want you to consider, because if COVID has done anything for us, it's helped us understand that huge disparity of experiences between those that have the privilege and those that don't. So I want to thank you very much. My email is on the final slide. You can reach me on all social media channels as Jurassic Girl with a 1 for the I, and I look forward to questions in the question and answer panel session. Thank you.